Hey everybody, John Lorden here. Welcome to another episode of BrainScratch for today, October 6th, 2017. I have to give a very big thank you to Christy Straysener, my associate producer who sometimes doubles up and does research work. She helped pull the research together for this episode. Thank you so much, Christy. I truly appreciate it. So what's going on in this episode? We have a tragedy involving a young man. We have a coroner saying there's a rather simple answer, and we have some evidence quite to the contrary. It's one of those stories, folks. Let's jump in with today's case, the tragedy of Joshua Maddux. And here we have a picture of him with one of his sisters, Ruth. He had two sisters, also had an older brother, but unfortunately his older brother did commit suicide when he was 18. Actually, I guess it was just around the time that he was going to graduate. We've got some other pictures here of Joshua. People describe him as smart, funny, and easygoing. His father did note that he seemed to have a rough couple of years after his brother killed himself. But let's roll forward to westward.com and see what we can learn about this case. You can see he was a missing person for a period of time. Here is a poster that was made with all of his critical information. 18-year-old Joshua Maddux was last seen at his home on the morning of May 8th, 2008. When his mother returned home later that morning, Joshua was gone. 1 year prior, Joshua's brother died, and the two were very close. Apparently, Joshua said that he was simply going out for a walk. His family says that he was known to do this, but he never came back. Mike Maddux, Joshua's father, describes his son as a brilliant young man who was shattered by the death of his brother, who took his life the week of his high school graduation. Then Mike went on, quote, "I went to work one day and came home and he wasn't there. The next day, he still didn't come home. I called all his friends. Nobody's seen him. Nobody knows where he is. I didn't know what to do, so I called the police." Foul play wasn't suspected. The likeliest scenario was that Joshua had simply run away, and since he was 18 at the time, he was legally an adult, making such a decision perfectly fine from a legal standpoint. Years passed without any news, but then on August 7th of 2015, in an old abandoned cabin that was being dismantled, construction workers found a body inside the chimney. That body was positively identified as Joshua Maddux. According to 9 News, coroner Al Bourne describes Maddux as a, quote, tall, skinny kid who was probably trying to crawl or climb down the chimney in order to gain access to the cabin when he got stuck. So there's that simple explanation that I've mentioned. Let's learn a little bit more about Joshua. The situation doesn't make sense at all, Maddux's older sister, Kate Maddux, told the Huffington Post. "We were really expecting him to be anywhere in the world, and he was actually very close." His sister did mention that at one time he said that he would probably go off exploring, that he was going to have some type of big grand adventure, and that he might not be in touch if he got to do that. So she did have a little bit of an expectation that he might disappear at some point, but that he would probably come back a few years later. She was hoping he would come back with a wife and maybe a couple of kids, but unfortunately that is not what happened in this case. "He told me he was going for a walk," Kate Maddux said. "Josh was an avid nature lover and loved to go for hikes." Joshua Maddux never returned. Days turned to weeks, weeks turned to months, and months turned to years. The young man's sister described him as creative and intelligent. His IQ was off the charts, she said. He spent most of his time writing fictional stories and playing music. He had an interesting and unique sense of style. People in his high school class knew him for being that awesome kid who wore a top hat and brought a briefcase to school instead of a backpack. There was this subtle sophistication about him that made him interesting and a standout. And here there is a childhood photo of Joshua. Now moving down to some details about when he was discovered. When the teen's skeleton was found, his knees reportedly were above his head and a hand was covering his face. Foul play is not suspected and the death has been ruled accidental. Quote, "It was not an instant death," the coroner, Bourne, told Huffington Post. How he died is only a matter of speculation, but we know he did not starve to death because that takes many weeks. So then you go down the chain and you have dehydration, which can take just a few days. And the other thing would be hypothermia, which could take a day or two. We have no evidence to say which one came first. I have seen some people speculating about this case. There's a couple of really interesting Reddit threads on this case. Someone has looked into the weather at that time when he disappeared. They say that it could have gotten into as low as the 20s. So hypothermia certainly is a possibility in this. There's also a very interesting twist when it comes to his clothes, but we will get to that. The coroner said the cabin's location, a wooded area with no adjacent homes, likely made it impossible for anyone to hear the teen's cries for help. He could have been yelling, but nobody would have heard him, Bourne told Huffington Post. Let me jump to a Google Street View. This supposedly is the cabin, and I've tried to compare it with pictures from known news stories of the cabin. I do believe it's a match. This one has been kicked around on Reddit threads, so take it with a slight grain of salt, but I've tried to compare it myself. I do think this is the cabin. If we look around here, first of all, there's some kind of parking lot just past the cabin. I'm not sure what that is, but almost looks like a cul-de-sac of some kind, a small a road that comes in there and has a turnabout. If we look to the right, there's homes. There's a home there. There's a home there. We pull out, we can look down the street. There's a home right across the street, right here. Looks like there's a church on the hill back that way. We look this direction, there's a home out over here. And keep in mind, this street view picture is taken from September of 2012. The cabin obviously was demolished. That's how they found him. They were in the act of taking it down. So you won't see it if you go there at this point. Supposedly it was being taken down so that they could put in, I don't know if it was an apartment building, but somehow they were going to fit 32 homes in this area. And if you look at this square of land, it does look like it's between two streets, and considering that you've got a bunch of houses around it, I wouldn't be surprised if they put up some type of maybe condo or townhouse complex there. But I don't know. I'm just curious that if someone was trapped in the chimney on this building and they were screaming, there would be, I believe, some opportunity for people around to hear that, depending on how far down the chimney he was and which way he was facing. And that's something that's kind of interesting about the description that we're hearing from the coroner, is about the position of his knees being above his head. That leads some people to believe that he was faced head down. According to information that I've reviewed, it seems more likely that he was actually face up, and his knees, his legs were kind of pulled up towards him and his feet were pointing downward. The coroner says specifically that his feet were pointing downward. So I don't believe that he was upside down like some people are assuming when they're reviewing this case. So far, we don't have a ton of information to really dispute the coroner's findings. It seems like Joshua maybe for some reason decided that he wanted to climb in this chimney, maybe to get access to this cabin that was probably locked up. Let's move on to denverpost.com and get some more detail. Rumors that Josh was killed and forced into the chimney have made their rounds. Josh was clad only in a ribbed thermal-type shirt. The rest of his clothes were found within the cabin outside the fireplace near the hearth. Okay, so this is where this case becomes very, very interesting. We find out he's only wearing this ribbed thermal shirt. He doesn't have any pants on. We're talking no underwear, no socks, no shoes, and those items are actually found inside the cabin. So the coroner is telling us he believes that Josh was trying to get into the cabin by climbing down the chimney. From the information that we're seeing here, it seems like at some point he was in the cabin, for some reason decided to remove his clothes and then possibly use the chimney to try to climb out. I've seen other people theorize that maybe he took off his clothes when he was in the chimney. I'm not sure why you would take your shoes off necessarily, especially if you were having a problem of being stuck. Maybe he thought he'd have better grip with his feet if he took his shoes off or something along those lines. But if I was going to attempt to climb up a chimney, I'd really want to make sure my shoes were on. I'm pretty sure that, there's a lot of soot in there, a lot of things where it'd probably be hard to get some grip. You'd have to keep yourself wedged from one wall to the other. I'd probably want to do that with my shoes, but according to the information we're seeing here, his clothes were actually found inside the cabin, which is a very, very strange twist in this. Quote, the hard tissue showed no signs of any trauma, Coroner Bourne said. There were no broken bones. There were no knife marks. There were no bullet holes. Officials were able to identify Josh through a combination of dental records, gender analysis, and forensics. Apparently, Josh had one finger that had some type of issue where I don't know if part of it was removed or it was some type of growth defect, but that finger helped them in the identification once they found the skeleton. Chuck Murphy, a Colorado Springs builder who owned the now demolished cabin, said his brother lived in the small space until about a decade ago. Since then, it was used for storage and rarely entered except for the occasional break-in. The place was damp, Murphy said. It smelled like hell. There was raccoon poop all over the place. Murphy says he was there when Josh's body was found as an earth mover peeled back a steel fireplace insert within the chimney. Murphy has raised doubts about the coroner's theory because of rebar installed atop the chimney to keep animals out. And for those of you that don't know what rebar is, that is very strong steel bar, usually has a kind of what looks like a threading that goes across all of it. From most of the rebar I've seen, I'm sure it probably comes in different gauges, but most of the rebar that I've seen, I would estimate, is probably a quarter to a half-inch diameter, pretty strong stuff. Very curious because if there was indeed a rebar mesh at the top of the chimney, how the heck did Joshua get into it? There's no way that guy crawled inside that chimney with that steel webbing, Murphy said, adding he thinks Maddux was forced into the space. He didn't come down the chimney. Woodland Park Police say the case is in the hands of the coroner's office. Quote, because of the way he ruled it, it's his case and not ours, Commander James Halloran said. Moving on to KKTV.com, we get another piece of interesting information. Bourne discounted the possibility that Maddux entered the chimney from inside the cabin, stating that a wood-burning insert in the fireplace would have prevented that. So look, we've got two people, both that I consider experts in some way. We've got the coroner and we've got the person that actually owned the building that knows about the chimney because he actually had it installed only about 25 years prior to this. The guy that owns the place says there's some type of metal grating on the top that would have stopped him from getting in. The coroner says there is an insert in the bottom that would have stopped him from getting in from the bottom. So how the heck did Joshua get in there? Over at nydailynews.com, we get some more info from Chuck Murphy. Chuck Murphy told the Gazette that a large piece of furniture blocked the fireplace, so there was never a reason to look inside of it. So even if you were inside of the cabin and saw where the fireplace was, there was a large piece of furniture that was put up against the fireplace. So once again, this raises a question. Of course, how did Josh get into that? But even if we're discussing Chuck's theory that Josh must have climbed up into it, how did he get this big piece of furniture back behind him once he climbed into the fireplace? I mean, I guess it's possible he got into the actual firebox section of the fireplace, turned around and tried to pull this stuff back towards him and then possibly climbed up from there. I'm really not sure because I don't know how big of a piece of furniture this is. We're going to get a little more detail on the furniture in a moment. We get another note at the Chicago Tribune about this large piece of furniture, but really not a lot of good detail. And that's one of the tough things about looking into this case is There's a lot of kind of small snippets on news sites from one news site to the next about him being found in the fireplace. But when you're trying to really crack down into the details of this case, for some reason, a lot of those articles are no longer available. Now, thankfully, some people at Reddit have been talking about this case for a long time, and some of them have copied and pasted some of the text from those articles into the threads. And of course, they have some interesting insight on the case as well. So let's jump over to a Reddit thread here. And of course, I'm going to have links for all this in the description box below, so you can look into this for yourself as well. Beach Glass Blazer says, in my opinion, it sounds like the cabin owners, the family that had it for 60 years, may not know or aren't properly describing the chimney top. They describe it as both rebar and steel webbing. Anyone could have popped or kicked off the ladder, for instance, if it was just some type of steel cover that was kind of added up there. We scroll down a little bit more. Tim Buck 2 says, the owner said the chimney was an addition to the original cabin and installed about 25 years ago. Now Wow says that's true. If the rebar was in reality more like the metal webbing on an average chimney cap, it seems very plausible that it could have been damaged or lost over 25 years. Here, Timbuk2 comes back and posts some information from an article that was originally at a publication called Pikes Peak Courier. I've seen several references to this Pikes Peak Courier with a few different articles about this case, but unfortunately, it looks like they've reformatted their website and these links are no longer working. But thankfully, Timbuk2 pasted some of the information in here. Quote, it was a heavy wire grate, a wire mesh installed across the chimney about one row of bricks from the top, Murphy said. We didn't want trouble with raccoons and things getting in the chimney. That sounds like a pretty solid explanation of it to me. It sounds like he knows exactly what he's talking about. He's got it down to which row of bricks, and we're talking only one row of bricks that was on top of that. So it's not like this was, you know, halfway or 3/4 way down the chimney and Joshua could have gotten down to that point before realizing he was in trouble and got stuck. But investigators didn't see it when they responded to the call of the body because his crew had already tossed it in a truck. Quote, they were just gathering up all the steel, angle iron, and things as part of the demolition, Murphy said. They had no idea the mesh had any significance. Keep in mind, they were demoing a house. They weren't expecting this to be the scene where they were going to find a body. So it's not like they were treating it like that type of scene. So they were taking the materials, they were figuring out some things are recyclable. They were probably separating that. The brick was probably being all trashed into a different area. And who knows, we don't have a good description of the time frame between when they started taking down that chimney and when they actually found him. There might have been a number of hours, could have even been a day or two between them starting that demo and actually finding him. Considering that they were using a piece of large equipment for doing this, I think it probably happened relatively closely. But once police were called out, were they really thinking, hey, where's all the rest of the pieces of this chimney so we can understand what this thing really looked like when it was all together? Probably not. And I don't think they realized that this was going to be such a point of contention until later. Otherwise, they probably would have looked into that information when they came on the scene. Quote, he was mostly naked inside the chimney, Murphy said. He was only wearing his thermal shirt, no pants, no shoes or socks. And here we finally get some detail on that piece of furniture. A large, heavy wooden breakfast bar had been ripped from a wall and dragged from the kitchen and placed across the front of the fireplace, blocking it. Quote, all I know is he did not go down that chimney. He got in the fireplace and went up. But why? I think it will remain a mystery, one of those sad stories. I'm kind of curious about the way that's worded, about how it says that a heavy wooden breakfast bar was ripped from the wall and dragged from the kitchen and placed across the fireplace. The way that's phrased, and it's weird because that's not actually Murphy saying that, it's just built into the article, but the way that's phrased, it's leading me to assume that Murphy didn't understand why that furniture was there. However, we do have quotes from him saying that he saw that that was there and he just didn't look up the fireplace because there was a big piece of furniture in the way. I'm just curious about that because if we do consider the theory that someone might have forced him in there or something along those lines, you know, like if there was, this is totally off the top of my head, folks, so don't take this as part of the official story, but if there was some bullies he ran into and they took him to this cabin and took him inside the cabin and somehow removed his clothes and somehow put him in the firebox portion of the fireplace and then took this heavy piece of furniture and closed him up in it and then left, could that potentially have been his motivation for trying to climb up and then he gets stuck on the way up and doesn't get out of the chimney? I think if we understood a bit more about this piece of furniture that was blocking the fireplace, like, does Murphy know how it got there or not? Is this something that was done when the house was vandalized at some point? Or is this something that his family decided to do because despite the rebar or metal grating at the top, maybe animals were still coming down through the fireplace? I don't know, but I really wish we had a better answer on that. And here, this is a diagram. This is not of the specific fireplace, although there's people that debate that on Reddit. I don't think this is the specific fireplace, but just so you get some idea, because I really didn't understand this either, the chimney does not necessarily sit directly over where you're having the fire. And of course that's logical because any time that it rained, you'd have water that would come down and basically put your fire out, which wouldn't work very well. So here you can get a bit of a better sense of what the design is like, that likely there is a different area between the chimney and between what is called the firebox where you actually put your wood for burning. You can see the mantle's here, and the hearth is right in this area. When you see it identified like this, that the hearth is in here and the hearth extension is out here, and you consider how they talked about his clothing being found near the hearth, I think we should consider that he had his clothing on when he was in the chimney and possibly removed it and dropped it. And maybe that is how it got into here. Once again, we don't have great detail. You know, if his clothing was found 1 foot in, 2 feet in, 3 feet in, we don't know. But if it was found close to what they are considering the hearth, which is what the quote says, I think it's very possible that he had that clothing on and dropped it in. Now here, notice there is what's called a throat damper and a smoke shelf. And this is an area where things get really, really tight and narrow. As a matter of fact, I have a fireplace here and there is essentially just what is maybe a 6-inch hole that is right above my firebox. There is no way that I can crawl up through that, certainly. But even outside of that, for older designs, you can see that there's still this kind of narrow area here because it's made to make sure that, you know, the weather and the elements doesn't necessarily come in, but there's still a way for smoke to get up and get out. So could he have gotten into the firebox and then crawled up around this little narrow ledge area? You know, the coroner describes him as a very lanky kid. I don't know. That's certainly what the owner seems to think happened. But of course, we have him and the coroner disagreeing on that. Someone on Web Sleuths was smart enough to go to the web archive to get one of the stories that has kind of disappeared from the internet on here. And we get much more detail about some conversation directly between the owner and the coroner about this case. On Monday, September 28th, Teller County Coroner Al Bourne ruled Maddux's death an accident, saying the 6-foot-tall, 150-pound teen had slid down the chimney, quote, Santa Claus style. 3 days later, Bourne reopened his investigation after the cabin owner, Colorado Springs builder Chuck Murphy, came forward with details about the chimney that he says makes the accidental death theory impossible. Bourne's reexamination also followed calls to his office from tipsters offering the names of people who allegedly had bragged about killing Maddux in the cabin. After a 2-hour meeting on Friday, Bourne and Murphy emerged with vastly different opinions of the case, agreeing only that no one will probably ever know exactly why Maddux died or how he ended up in the chimney. Murphy remains convinced Maddux was murdered, either forced up the chimney alive, trapped there and left to die, or he was killed in the cabin and his remains forced through the damper and into the smoke chamber just above the firebox. Bourne acknowledged the questions are compelling, but he concluded late Friday the proper cause of death ruling remained accidental, caused by sliding down the chimney and becoming trapped. Quote, "We've come up with the most plausible explanation and it will remain an accident," Bourne said. "He did come down the chimney. That's our conclusion." As for the steel grate at the top of the chimney, Bourne said it could have disintegrated over the years due to rust and corrosion, or a chimney sweep may have removed it. Nobody saw the metal mesh, Bourne said. "We didn't see it in any of our photos. It may have disappeared." And there is no explanation for why Maddux may have stripped to just a shirt. "This one really taxed our brains," Bourne said. "We found his clothes just outside the firebox. We don't know why he took his clothes off, took his shoes and socks off, and why he went outside, climbed on the roof, and went down the chimney. It was not linear thinking." So that whole theory really, really baffles me. The explanation that I had that he took his clothes off and just dropped them down seems a lot more plausible, but for some reason the coroner doesn't seem to be considering that. He thinks that Joshua was in the cabin, took his clothes off, went outside naked, despite the area that we saw, which there are actually homes around there, climbed up onto the roof, which I've seen no analysis about how he gets up on the roof. Is there a ladder out there? Did they figure out his path up onto the roof? I've seen nothing about any of that. And then decides to come down the chimney to get into a house that he already had access to. If the coroner thinks that he took his clothes off in there, that really, really doesn't make sense. So, of course, based off that, you have some people that might consider, was there some type of drug use going on or something like that? Quote, "We found no indication of drugs, and according to the family, he was not into using drugs," Bourne said. To suspect a crime, Bourne said investigators needed to find evidence like duct tape or ropes that may have bound him, or signs in the soot of the firebox showing footprints, or other marks of a body being stuffed up it. It would take at least 2 people to move him into the position he was in, as neatly packaged as he was inside the chamber, Bourne said. If there were more people involved, we have absolutely no clues. Unless something else comes forward, that would change the whole situation. That's where we're at. Others have come forward with names of suspects, including long circulating rumors of a man who bragged he killed Maddux. Christy did send me some info on this man. He has been talked about. There is even a Reddit thread that is specifically about him possibly being involved. His name is Andrew Newman. This is a picture of him. I looked into this aspect a little bit, and I could not find anything tying him to either knowing Josh or being in the area at the time outside of what was written by one particular person on Reddit. And for me, that's just not quite enough information. So I'm not including a lot more info about him, but I did want to let you know about this character, Andrew Newman. If you're looking into this case for yourself, you can decide to chase that down. Just know I couldn't find anything that connected him to to being at this area at the time, or to even knowing Josh. So, and even according to this article, authorities can't positively place him in Woodland Park when Maddux disappeared. "I know it's not a natural death, and I'm confident it's not suicide," the coroner said. "My other options are an accidental death, homicide, and undetermined cause of death. It is frustrating. We can't pin it down." Yeah, and I completely agree, although I don't know that it should have necessarily been labeled as an accidental death. I think saying that it was undetermined, especially when you have some conflicting information like this, is probably the better thing to do. I don't know if the coroner's department, if they have like statistics where they track these different categorizations. I would assume that if a coroner says it's an accidental death, and I don't have to assume it, we heard the police in this case say it. If the coroner says it's an accidental death, that concludes the investigation. The police work is done. If the coroner says it's an undetermined cause of death, I don't think that necessarily closes the case out. I don't know that for a fact, but I would have to assume that if it's undetermined, there's still the possibility that it's homicide. So personally, I would have been a bit more comfortable if the coroner would have said that this was undetermined cause of death. He doesn't know. I mean, by his own words, he doesn't know how Joshua died. He's got it down to a couple of theories, either, dehydration, possibly the weather got to him with how cold it was. We've talked about this in certain cases before. People do strange things when they do begin to freeze. Some of them feel like their skin is burning and they remove their clothing. That might explain some of what happened in this case as well. But even by the coroner's own theories here, he doesn't seem to believe that the clothing just fell down the chimney, which really doesn't make sense to me. And if we look at the design of the chimney, it's not a straight drop. If Joshua was truly in the chimney and dropped something straight down, it's going to hit a ledge. It's not necessarily going to make it into the firebox. And we're talking several items here. So I'd be very surprised even if his shoes might have been able to bounce and get into the firebox, I'd be surprised about other clothing like his pants and things like that somehow making that zigzag and getting down into the firebox. It just doesn't really make a lot of sense for me. And that is essentially why we are looking at this case on BrainScratch. There are just aspects of this case that we can't answer. And even the officials are acknowledging they can't answer. But for some reason, they've still got it labeled as an accidental death and closed it out. Ultimately, a family did find out where their missing son and brother wound up. And here we have a comment from his sisters.
His family is devastated by the news, but grateful for closure.
I am relieved that we finally are able to give him a proper burial, and because that's what he deserves.
The death has been ruled an accident.
And I think we can at least be thankful for that his family has an answer to where he is and was able to give him a proper burial. I think it's terrible that they had to face this type of tragedy after losing their other brother, also at the age of 18. Just a terrible, hard thing for this family to go through. I believe that the parents got divorced. I don't know if it's related to this at all, but the father even stayed in the same home because he was hoping that Joshua would eventually find his way back home. But unfortunately, that is not the case. So, Brain Scratchers, here's where I turn it over to you. What do you think happened in this case? Is there some aspect to this that we've missed? Is there some other theory that could potentially be going on here? Let's talk about it in the comments below. I ask that we please stay respectful to this matter. The families on a lot of these cases are coming to these videos more and more often. So please be respectful as we discuss this. I truly, truly appreciate it. And thank you for spending some time with me here today. Hope you have a nice Friday. You have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you back here on the Lord and Arch channel on Monday.